This video is going to further discuss scientific integrity. So as you saw in the John Oliver video, and a little humorous light, is that researchers face ethical issues in the analysis and reporting of data. And it's not just that, it's then the media also sometimes misrepresents that information as well. So one thing is write out fraud, right? When individuals either fabricate data, they misrepresent their data, they draw conclusions that aren't accurate, and there's a variety of different reasons for doing that. As you heard in the video, a lot of times it's this idea of publish or perish. People are under this pressure to publish papers so that they can get more grants and get more funding. If you're at a research institution like UCLA, UC Berkeley, USC, UCI, UC San Diego, or others across the country, and you're the primary investigator of a lab, your job is to get grants, and that brings money to that university. That's first and foremost what your job is. And in order to do that, you have to publish and show a track record that you're making progress in your research. So there's that pressure. There's also the postdocs, people who are postgraduate school who are working and trying to get that research position at a university, and sometimes they feel pressure that they need to please their boss, basically, so that they can keep their job, or so that they can move forward, or that they have a track record of publishing articles so that they can eventually move on and get a position at a research university. Then you have the graduate students who just want to graduate. They just sometimes there's different things, and so I've seen it at different levels. I've seen my advisor for my postdoc. He basically had his own little pet hypothesis about, it's not just his, there were a lot of people, and I still think that it's valid, that oxidative stress, is the cause of some of the negative effects we see as we age. And a lot of his research had been done by certain individuals, and then, 10, 15 years later, when I joined the lab, we were having trouble with the more advanced technologies that we had. We were having trouble replicating those studies. And so he had a reputation for, if you couldn't replicate it or he didn't like the data that you were bringing to him, he would take that project and he'd give it to somebody else until they would give him what he wanted, basically. I had another friend who she worked in a lab with an individual, and it was a brand new lab starting up, a new research professor, and they were going to do cell culture research. So the first thing they had to do was get the cells to grow in culture, in a petri dish, basically. And everyone was having problems. And then all of a sudden, by some miracle, this one graduate student started having luck, supposedly. And not only luck with keeping the cells alive, but by doing these other studies where they were basically squirting in different toxins and then squirting in something else to see if it was protective. It's a simplistic view of what it was. And my friend said that she would go over and she would write everything in pencil, and then she'd go back to her computer and she'd type some stuff in, and then she'd erase stuff and she'd rewrite things in. So basically she wasn't, you're supposed to write in your lab notebook in pen. It's supposed to be a permanent record of what you do, and she wasn't doing that. And so the advisor, though, wasn't in the lab, didn't know what was going on. And then she went on, she got some awards, she published papers, and one day shortly after she had left, he came into the lab and asked where all of her notebooks were, and he frantically grabbed them all, went into his office and locked them in a drawer. So they figured that he had finally figured out that what she had published was false data, and he just kind of went along with it. I had some postdocs in the lab when I first joined USC. They left shortly afterwards, and my advisor asked me to go through and look at the slides that they had done where they had published research. And I went back and I'm looking at these slides going, there's no way that they could have done the analysis that they said that they did. The slides didn't have what they said they had on. So they had made stuff up. So unfortunately, I came across a lot of this, and that's probably one of the reasons why I left research to do teaching. I don't want to make you think that all research is fraudulent. There are some good publications out there, and sometimes it's not on purpose. Sometimes accidents happen. There is error, right? The other type of scientific integrity that's important is plagiarism. And plagiarism is something that we've talked about previously. I moved it to another module to have it earlier on in the semester. So we've covered that already. And again, it's something important that you need to know, not just for this class and for writing literature reviews and papers and things like that, but for your college career, it's important as well. And fraud, it doesn't just apply to people at research universities. Fraud applies to your research project. So I do certain things towards the end of the semester to hold you accountable. Like when you analyze your data, you have to send me your data and your output so that I know that you actually did analyze that data correctly. So again, fraud in science is, again, that explicit effort of a researcher to falsify or misrepresent data rather than error. So I talked about a few examples already. So the question is why do they commit fraud? And I think I already alluded to this a little bit as well. But again, this idea is to maintain competitiveness in their academic environment, concerned that if their research isn't published, they may fail. And that's this idea of publish or perish. And I'm going to give you some other specific examples that are in the literature. So this is a study that the idea of this study that linking childhood vaccine and autism was fraudulent. And so you could come back and listen to this by clicking that link that I just clicked in the lecture notes. But basically, the idea was that this is the original Wakefield paper that came out and said that, report that 12 kids, 8 of whom who had gastrointestinal trouble and regressive autism, that they found evidence that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine was causing these symptoms. So Wakefield's license was revoked in 2010. Some problems is that clearly not all of the individuals in the study clearly had autism. The study said they were symptom-free before the vaccine. This wasn't true. Some researchers that worked on the study with Wakefield later on said that they fabricated data because he asked them to. And unfortunately, these type of situations have become more and more common. And then here are just 2 other examples. And it's become so common, there's actually something called Retraction Watch now. So this one to me was quite troubling. So I don't know, hopefully you recognize his name, Hans Eysenck. He was big in the field of personality. So 13 papers were retracted. They flagged 61 of them, and some of them are 60 years old. So years and years of research have been built on some of these papers that he wrote. And so 2 journals retracted 13 papers co-authored by Hans Eysenck. And another example here. This one I thought was kind of alarming as well. So an ex-lab tech at Duke University was banned from federal funding, which doesn't always happen. So sometimes these papers get retracted, they get a little slap on the wrist. Some people get their licenses removed or whatnot, but a lot of times nothing happens. And so she actually lost the idea to ever get federal funding for grants again because she faked data that linked to 60 NIH grants. And so NIH would be the National Institute of Health. And these grants are basically giving money to the university to do research. And so that's a lot of data. I think it also goes on and talks about the number of papers that, so here, 2 tables and 39 published papers, 3 manuscripts, and 2 research papers. So 117 figures. So intentionally falsifying and fabricating research data. So unfortunately it's out there. But again, I don't want you to think that means that everything you read is not any good. That's not true. But just being aware that there is this fraud in science and it's become so prevalent that now we have things like Retraction Watch. And that unfortunately some things that have become theory, sometimes we find later on that they can't be replicated. So what are some safeguards to prevent fraud? The main thing is experimental studies need to be replicated. So if studies can't be replicated, then that's a sign that perhaps something went wrong in that first study, even though that it was peer-reviewed. So we do need to have peer-reviewed articles. There are some places where you can, put your data out there on the internet now that we have that. And if it's not peer-reviewed, you don't know really, unless you know how to judge the statistical analysis, you don't know if it was done properly. This is another one that's becoming more common, is data must be shared. And so it's always been upon request. So if you go to publish your paper and they want to check your data, you have to be willing to share it, and nothing can be, photoshopped and things like that. But now, more and more often, people are putting their data out there, and it's shared with the public. And it's nice because it actually creates these databases, and a lot of times psychologists don't actually gather the data themselves. They use these large databases and come up with their own research questions. And then the consequences of being found guilty of fraud need to be a big deterrent. I personally don't think that there is a big enough deterrent right now. I think there should be more that is done. But it's difficult because who's responsible? If it's the postdoc that's fabricating the data, maybe the primary investigator doesn't know that they're doing that. Is it their responsibility to know that? Maybe that primary investigator is telling that postdoc to fraudulently, fabricate that data. So it's hard to say.